Mac Loftin. Welcome to Theology U, where we talk to academics and authors about God and faith in a way that anyone can understand without any background knowledge. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. This is now our second in-person interview. Again, I don't have my AirPods in. Mac's here at the Harvard studio. So excited to talk to you about your dissertation, which you're walking for. We're recording now in June. This episode won't go up till probably midsummer.
Okay.
But you're getting ready to walk for graduation?
Yes, I am. Yeah. In a week and a half, I think. Yeah.
It's good stuff. So Mac actually came, for people listening, Mac came and spoke in a couple of my classes at Harvard this past school year about your dissertation, which I can never remember the title of.
The short title is The Renunciation of God, and it's a dissertation about three writers from the 20th century: Georges Bataille, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Simone Weil.
And what was the inspiration for that?
Yeah, so the inspiration for that was I had initially been interested in these figures as kind of historical, theologians, and mostly interested in the kind of theology that they were writing that just so happened to be around the 1930s and 1940s. Kind of disinterested from the political context, mostly just interested in the ideas themselves. And then the 2016 election happened, and I found that all I could think about was politics all the time. And it was sort of this light bulb moment where I was like, oh, if I can only think about politics all the time whenever I'm reading and writing theology in this situation, like how much more so must that have been the case in the 1930s and 40s, in this like much more volatile moment. And so then I started paying attention to, okay, how are these texts being written that seem kind of on the surface like they're strictly theological or strictly literary or philosophical texts? It must have been the case that the people writing these were also just constantly anxious about politics, constantly thinking about politics. And so what is going on in these texts that is also political? And so that kind of got the wheels turning and kind of gave rise to this very specific way of, gave rise for me to this very specific way of reading kind of theological texts as always being at the same time, to some degree, political texts. And so through research, there's this whole body of work that goes by the name political theology, this kind of method of analysis that kind of looks at how is it that political writings and movements are always somehow at the same time theological, and theological writings and movements are always at the same time political, kind of looking at that Venn diagram overlap between the two. And so I kind of took those methods of analysis and brought them to bear on these three writers who are some of my favorite from that time period.
Yeah. And I would think with 2024 election and now 2025, it's all the more.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing. It's just I'm constantly anxious about politics. And so am kind of always, whenever I'm reading theology or writing theological arguments, I'm kind of always bringing those broader political concerns to those, kind of wondering, okay, how can this theological text help me understand the particular political situation that we're in, and kind of how can it help me negotiate that, even if it seems on the surface to not be a very political text.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if there's a better time in American history to think about faith and politics. So it's cool stuff. I we'll spend most of today talking about Bonhoeffer, who's one of your three. Perhaps we'll have to do 2 more episodes.
Yeah, maybe.
But Bonhoeffer, I think, is someone who a lot of Christians are familiar with. At least, like, your pastor has quoted some Bonhoeffer, or you've heard of the cost of discipleship, or those kind of ideas. Could you give like a brief bio for Bonhoeffer, and then we'll talk about?
Yeah, so very brief bio. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a theologian and a pastor in Germany, mostly active in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. He very famously spent, I think it was 1 year, maybe it was 2 years, doing a postdoc at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. So he spent some time in America. And while at Union, he attended a Black church, the Abyssinian AME Church, and taught Sunday school there. And he was very disillusioned with the theological education that he was getting at the seminary. But he was very taken with the theological education and the kind of forms of worship and theology that he saw at in this church in Harlem. and then came back to Germany. And when the Nazis took over in 1933, he was at the time a theology professor, and he became very involved in what gets remembered as an anti-Nazi movement called the Confessing Church, but they were not as anti-Nazi as Bonhoeffer wanted them to be, and so he was kind of involved in pushing this movement. He wanted it to be a really anti-Nazi movement within the German churches. The German churches at the time were split between a kind of pro-Nazi and this, what he wanted to be an anti-Nazi movement, this thing called the church struggle in Germany. So he was very involved in the church struggle as the Nazis took over. He ended up leading a kind of illegal underground seminary where he wanted to train anti-Nazi pastors. And then, which we will talk about soon, he got swept up in this plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. He was very much, we'll talk more about this, he was very marginal to that plot. His involvement was very minimal. But he was kind of swept up. He was involved. And that involvement ended up leading to his imprisonment and eventual execution at Flossenburg concentration camp just 2 weeks before the camp's liberation at the end of the war.
Yeah, so I guess let's talk about it. Of course, we also had the movie come out, which I think was the end of last year.
Yeah, it was in the fall, October and November last year.
Yeah. So let's talk, because I think a lot of people will be familiar or have heard that he was involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler.
Yes.
Talk about why you're laughing as you say.
Yeah. So that's the thing that everybody knows Bonhoeffer as. I mean, people remember some of his key writings like Cost of Discipleship, or some key ideas like cheap grace and costly grace. Yep. But really, when people think about Bonhoeffer, they think about him being executed by the Nazis, and specifically for his involvement in this plot to assassinate Hitler. And so people like to imagine Bonhoeffer as this kind of, he's a pastor, he's a theologian, but he's also a spy. He's kind of an action hero. You know, that's what the movie really plays up, is this sort of action movie version of Bonhoeffer's life. The reality is he was involved in this plot. This is for people who don't know, it's called the July 20th plot. If you've ever seen the movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise, that is about this plot to assassinate Hitler, that involved members of the German intelligence service, like a vague analog to the CIA. They're kind of military intelligence. So it primarily was a plot by members of that who wanted to overthrow Hitler. Bonhoeffer had been... He was a member of the German intelligence services, that his friend got him this job in the intelligence services kind of as a way to keep him out of military service, and to kind of, because it was this kind of hotbed for anti-Nazi activity. And so his actual involvement in the plot was that he passed documents from this German intelligence group that was plotting to overthrow Hitler. He passed documents between them and England because of his involvement in the ecumenical movement. He had all these contacts with the English church, and so he was passing documents that were basically saying, like, hey, there is this group of Germans that want to overthrow the Nazi regime, and and kind of build a new regime in its wake. Can we get help from England? And basically all of these messages went ignored. England kind of assumed any Germans sending messages were either completely powerless or not to be trusted. And so he passed these documents. Nothing happened.
It was too good to be true.
Yeah. It was either that the resistance movement was so desiccated that this was not actually something that was worth supporting, or it was a trap. And so they pretty much ignored all the messages. So and that was the extent of his involvement, was kind of handing these documents that these British guys were like, yeah, we're not doing anything.
So that was it.
Yeah. It was very minimally involved. I mean, he was sort of surreptitiously involved in some efforts to smuggle Jewish people out of Germany into Switzerland. That was kind of what was more directly involved in his arrest. But he was very tangentially involved in this conspiracy. So what happens is he gets arrested because of his kind of associations with this disloyal group of people in the intelligence community, and because of his involvement with efforts to smuggle Jewish people into Switzerland. And then he's trying to get out. He's trying to get a lawyer. The letters and papers from prison involve him really trying to like get a court date, get a lawyer so he can get out of jail. And then the assassination attempt happens on July 20th. It fails. It was a suitcase bomb in Hitler's bunker during a meeting that went off, and Hitler survived. There was this effort by the Nazis to kind of investigate it, figure out who was involved. They found a diary of someone involved with a list of names in it that included Bonhoeffer's, even though he was this very marginal figure. And so basically everyone whose name was on this list was killed. And so he was transported to a concentration camp and executed. And so people, despite how marginal his involvement was in this plot, people really jump on this idea of he was involved in this plot.
Yep.
Mostly because there are very few role models for Christians in Nazi Germany. Most people kept their heads down and went along with what was happening. And a lot of the people who did speak out and were critical of the movement were themselves, anti-Semitic to some degree, were themselves kind of politically messy. This July 20th plot that Bonhoeffer was tangentially involved in, a lot of those guys were themselves right-wing nationalist authoritarians. They mostly didn't like Hitler because they thought he was doing a bad job at carrying out the war, not because they were committed anti-fascists who were really upset with treatment of Jews and other minorities. And so Bonhoeffer's like the guy. Like he was the guy who understood what was going on. He called out the Nazi regime for anti-Semitism, for racism, and he was involved in this plot. And so I think people really jump on him as like, look, here's a guy who's a man of thought and a man of action. And so the degree to which he was a man of action in that specific way, that action movie way, gets really played up. As we saw in the movie this fall, which really presents Bonhoeffer as action hero Bonhoeffer.
Yep. Yeah, I think, and it makes sense, right? You look at this obviously like terrible time, and you think, as a Christian, you want to think that Christians were the good guys. You want to think that we were on the right side of history, or, and so then you see this plot, however he's involved in, and I think it's easy to take that as, if you think Bonhoeffer's a good guy, good Christian leader, and he was okay with assassinating Hitler, it's a very easy jump to go, okay, if the scenario presented itself again, this is the right thing to do. This is the Christian thing to do.
Yeah.
And you've helped me understand why that's wrong. But I think it'd be helpful to talk for someone who watched the movie and thinks, like as a Christian, if I was in Nazi Germany, I would try to kill Hitler. Like that would be the right thing to do. Yeah. Because I think that's certainly how it's portrayed in the movie. Yeah. And it's just like almost a common sense way to think about it. Could you talk about that, the ethical component of what's happening?
So the movie gives very much a sort of Hollywood movie version of World War II, where it's a battle between good guys and bad guys, where you can clearly tell who are the bad guys, who are the good guys. The Nazis are the bad guys. They're wearing the scary uniforms. They're marching around. The good guys are the ones who are fighting them. And Bonhoeffer is a good guy. He's against the Nazis. And so the great moral dilemma that the movie presents, the kind of moral tension of the movie is, will Bonhoeffer have the strength to do what he knows is right? Right. That he knows that he needs to kill Hitler, that Hitler has to be stopped. But stopping Hitler, stopping the Nazis involves violence. And Bonhoeffer was a pacifist. And so the moral drama of the movie is like, well, will he have the strength to renounce his pacifism or to make an exception to his pacifism and do this violent thing that needs to be done? Is he going to be tough enough to do what's necessary? And that makes for a compelling-ish movie. I mean, I think as a work of art, I think the movie's not very good, but it's a popcorn movie. And like what makes popcorn movies about World War II kind of have their pop is like, okay, is the good guy going to find the strength of will to do the bad things to the bad guys?
Yep.
Which is almost even verbatim how it's presented in the movie. There's a scene where Bonhoeffer talks about like, all I have are my dirty hands that I gotta use to do this dirty stuff, which is it makes it for a sort of popcorn munching movie, but it is completely removed from Bonhoeffer's own thinking. Because for Bonhoeffer, it was not the moral dilemma that he felt himself in was not, will I have the strength to do what I know is right? The moral dilemma is, I am in a situation in which there is no right thing to do. I can only do wrong things. I have to choose between these wrong outcomes. And what am I going to do? So in the time in which Bonhoeffer was involved in the conspiracy until his arrest, he wrote this book that was later published as The Ethics, which is hundreds and hundreds of pages of essays on ethics. And it basically boils down to him saying that Christian ethics, people tend to think of Christian ethics as like giving a list of rules for Christians to follow. Here are the things that you should do. Here are the things you shouldn't do. Here's the right thing. Here's the wrong thing. And he begins the ethics by saying that's not what Christian ethics is at all. Christian ethics is about exploding that entire way of thinking of, we have rules, we have, there's good things to do, there's bad things to do. He says, there's only bad things to do. We're thrown into a situation in which we cannot do the right thing. And that for Bonhoeffer was the important thing of Christian ethics, is to make us see that no matter how we act, we are necessarily going to do the wrong thing. And so all we can do then is throw ourselves at God's feet and beg for forgiveness for the wrong that we can't help but do. This necessary wrong. And so in the ethics, he's writing, he's wanting to publish this, so he doesn't ever really specifically say, I'm thinking about killing Hitler.
Sure.
He's smart enough to not put that in writing while he's involved in this conspiracy. But he's agonizing the whole time over this wrong that he feels by necessity he is driven to commit. And the one thing that he does not want to do is give an argument in which killing is justified. He begins from this principle that like killing is always wrong because God loves every single person, including the person who you think it cannot be possible for God to love, including someone like Hitler.
Right.
Like Hitler is someone whom God loves. And so to kill even him is to kill someone whom God loves, which is wrong. Which he takes this as like the absolute bedrock of his moral thinking. And yet, at the same time, he's in a situation where if he sat idly by and says, well, I'm a pacifist, so I can't do anything, that would also be wrong, because he would be allowing this machine of death to keep going when he's in a position to do something to stop it. So he sees himself as torn between these two decisions of kill Hitler, don't kill Hitler.
Right.
And he says, there's no right answer. There's no answer that is going to get me out of this dilemma. There's no answer there's no path that I can take and then look back and say, oh, I did the good thing and now I am good. My choice has made me good. My violence has made me good. Yeah. He says, no, violence is always wrong and it cannot make you good. And yet there are situations in which you are forced by necessity to commit it. And so he's just, like, for him, this is total agony. Like, he's just agonized in this writing. He constantly brings up how he feels torn, how he uses really descriptive language of like being in like a gray fog, unable to see the way through. He's just like morally destroyed by this dilemma where he cannot do anything other than sin, than do the wrong thing and beg for forgiveness. And none of that's in the movie. In the movie, he very clearly knows right from wrong. The right thing to do is kill the bad guys. And so he just needs to gather the strength to kill the bad guys because that violence will purify him. It will be morally justified. But in the ethics, it's very clear that these actions cannot be justified. There's no kind of argument of like, oh, Hitler deserves it, or, oh, what's one life weighed against millions of lives? In any of these kind of moral arguments that Bonhoeffer sees, we do to kind of assuage our conscience. We do to convince ourselves that we are good, that we are the source of our own goodness. That, oh, look, I was faced with this decision and I puzzled it out and I figured out the right answer, aren't I a good person?
Yep.
For Bonhoeffer, no. Ethical thinking has to begin with moral failure, with moral weakness, with the impossibility of ever doing good. And ultimately, that means moral thinking just begins with trust in God's forgiveness.
I think that's a good way to put at the end, is trust in God's forgiveness.
Yeah.
So for someone who's, I mean, I think it is a hard thing to wrap your head around, that like you cannot do the right thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like a different way of thinking about total depravity.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
no matter, I'm going to sin no matter what.
Yeah.
Almost like you're saying. So in that, if we keep going, he still does decide to be involved
Right.
in the plot, or he's still technically, okay with it. So then how is he making that decision? Is he making it with a different set of values? Like, is he saying, okay, I can't make the right decision, so I'm going to say, like you mentioned, I'm going to weigh one life over a million lives, and I'm going to go along with it, knowing, but still not feeling good about it. Is that kind of the thought process?
Not really, because even that presupposes a certain kind of moral justification,
right,
of like choosing the lesser evil. Of
yeah.
Like, okay, I'm presented with these two choices. This is the lesser evil, so I'm going to take it. And he writes this document that he circulates among members of the conspiracy that kind of lays out all of the different moral arguments that someone could give for what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And he just like detonates them one by one. And he has one where he talks about the lesser evil argument. And he says, we could think that we're choosing the lesser evil. We have these two options. We pick the one that seems the least bad to us.
Mm-hmm.
But he says, but we're finite human beings. Our judgments are limited. Our knowledge is limited. Our ability to actually see what moral decisions we're taking is so limited that you can never actually be confident that you're choosing the lesser evil. You could pick something that looks like the lesser evil, and then only after the fact realize that actually you chose the worst evil. Like, I think he doesn't say this explicitly, but I think he's imagining a situation in which, okay, the plot succeeds, Hitler is assassinated, someone else takes over, and that someone else who takes over is maybe more competent at, carrying out the war aims, less delusional, less kind of manic in the way that Hitler was, kind of more methodical. And so, like, what if we do this because we think, well, this is the worst thing, and so we need to prevent it, and then actually something worse happens.
Yeah.
So he is very much aware that we are finite beings, and our knowledge, our moral knowledge, our knowledge of whatever moral situation we find ourselves in is always clouded. We're always kind of in this fog, in this twilight. And so we're acting always with partial information, always with partial sight.
Mm-hmm.
And so he comes to the decision that he comes to in a way that's like, as a reader, 80 years after the fact, it's hard to then find what his reasoning is for doing this, because he's very suspicious of any reason that could be given for his action. Mm. So he in the ethics, he describes it as responsible action, where he says, like, I am thrown into this situation and I'm acting in the way that seems to me in this moment to be the most responsible, but I can't be confident that I'm making the right decision. Mm. And so I have to just confess my sinfulness when I do this. I have to confess my wrong. Like, I have to be involved in this effort to take Hitler's life because it seems to me in the moment that this is the necessary thing, that this is what I'm being driven to do. And yet at the very moment that I'm doing it, I have to throw myself at God's feet and beg forgiveness for this crime, this sin of murder, and possibly, all of the after effects of this act that I can't foresee, because what if this makes everything so much worse? What are the unintended effects of my action? I have to confess all of that and just throw myself in my complete ignorance and moral failure and guilt at God's feet and just trust that I will be forgiven. Hmm. So it's murky. There's no kind of clear thread of like, here's why he's doing it in a very deliberate way. He doesn't want to give you a trail of thinking. So then you could say, oh, well, I want to be like Bonhoeffer because he did the right thing. So let me follow his reasoning, because that's the exact thing that he's suspicious of. Like, if he gives us a pattern of moral thinking at all, it's not in his decision-making process. It's in that refusal to justify what he's doing, and in that faith in God's forgiveness, and in that insistence that you can never be sure that you're doing the right thing. And anytime you feel like you're sure that you're doing the right thing, you should have alarm bells going off on in your head, because that is a clearest sign that you have taken a wrong step at some point.
Yeah, that is so interesting. It's so countercultural. So often it is like, trust your conscience, trust God's guidance in your life, and like, you will do more good than bad. Than,
Well,
like apologize when you do something wrong.
Yeah.
But like, it's not, there's certainly the assumption that you could do something good.
Exactly.
Do something purely good.
And I think a lot of Christians have this really nefarious assumption that as Christians, we are somehow blessed with clearer moral sight than others, that we can kind of see better than other people what's right and what's wrong, or that we have a better rule book for how we act. We know the list of things that you shouldn't do and the list of things that you should do, and other people are confused about that list. And Bonhoeffer, I think he gives us a way of thinking like, well, if we do have any kind of like distinctive Christian moral sense or something, it's not that we have more clarity. It's that we should know that we don't have any kind of clarity, that like we should be, he has this line in the Ethics where he says, Christian ethics is the critique of all ethics. That kind of the Christian ethical position for him is this purely critical one that looks at any list of rules of right and wrong and kind of shreds it and says like, no, we can't see. It's this posture of real moral humility, real humility and moral judgments that feels so rare among Christians today, who really want Christianity to be, this kind of ticket to moral clarity. And I think the especially perverse thing is that some of Bonhoeffer's loudest champions, people who most index themselves to Bonhoeffer, do so in a way to position themselves as having the most moral clarity, that they kind of say, oh, look, Bonhoeffer was the one guy in Germany who knew right from wrong. And so I'm going to be like Bonhoeffer, and I'm going to know right from wrong. And I'm going to be able to tell who are the bad guys today, who are the bad guys in our society. Yeah. And then maybe I'll have the strength to do what needs to be done to them.
So you're saying his most serious fans are doing the exact thing that he would have said not to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's, we see that in the movie, which is it is very clearly heavily inspired by this biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer by Erich Metaxas, who is a right-wing cultural commentator, former VeggieTales writer. I can't remember if he created it or if he wrote it. He was a writer on VeggieTales, which I loved as a kid. And he has since become a real right-wing culture warrior. During the 2020 election, he like punched a protester in the run-up to the Stop the Steal thing. And he presents Bonhoeffer in his biography as a kind of culture warrior who saw what was right, who had the clear sense of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And beyond Metaxas, there have been a lot of like abortion clinic bombers who have indexed their actions to Bonhoeffer, who have invoked this very trendy term called the Bonhoeffer moment, which is a term that gets used by people to describe a particular situation in which a political crisis has become so acute, that things are so bad that what was previously unallowable behavior now becomes allowable. And people describe this as a Bonhoeffer moment. People say, are we living in a Bonhoeffer moment right now? And so there have been some abortion clinic bombers and assassins of abortion doctors who've described abortion as a Bonhoeffer moment. That this is a moral crisis that is so acute that we can't be pacifists. We have to turn to violence. Metaxas brought up, the 2020 quote unquote stealing the election as a Bonhoeffer moment. That this is a political crisis in which violence is now justified. And even some people on the left have talked about the Trump presidency as a Bonhoeffer moment. Is this a situation in which political violence is necessary to stop authoritarianism or something? And the idea is that Bonhoeffer lived in a situation in Nazi Germany, which was, the crisis was so acute that things were so bad that he renounced his pacifism and turned to violence as this kind of like, this is a moment of exception in which violence is now justified. That's the Bonhoeffer moment. But again, the thing about Bonhoeffer is that he says there is no situation in which violence is justified. There is perhaps a situation in which violence is necessary, in which we are constrained to do it. He certainly felt himself constrained to be involved in this plot. But he never, ever thought that this could be justified. And so the idea of the Bonhoeffer moment, I think, is a complete misreading of his legacy, in that, like you just said, it's doing the exact opposite of what he wanted to do. It's saying
I'm doing the right thing.
This
is the right thing to do. I must do it.
Yeah. And then it's seeking some sense of confidence in one's own right moral standing.
Yeah.
You say, okay, I want to do some violence against the bad guys, but I want to be sure that it's good and that it's going to make me good. I want to feel confident that I'm doing the right thing. Right. And like for Bonhoeffer, you can never have that kind of confidence ever. Like that is the real Bonhoeffer moment, is a moment in which you feel completely lost and completely confused as to what the right thing to do is. And you have no choice but to just act and say, well, I'm going to ask for God's forgiveness.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of is Abraham taking Isaac up to sacrifice Isaac.
Yeah.
And thinking, okay, that was like a direct command from God. And yet, like, I'm sure Abraham on the way up the mountain was feeling conflicted about it, right? There is no like, God told me to do this, so this is the right thing to do. It's like there's no clean conscience. I feel like is the theme here.
Yeah.
Is like and it's like almost to think you have a clean conscience, or to insist that, like you said, your ability to discern what's right is right.
Yeah.
Is like the ultimate. It's like, to me, it sounds like the worst thing. Like the almost the worst trap.
Yeah. And so like Bonhoeffer in the winter semester of 1932 to 1933, so kind of right as the Nazis are really beginning to take power, he gives a lecture course on the book of Genesis. And so he's thinking through all of this as like the temptation in the garden, you know, this idea that you can have knowledge of good and evil yourself, right? That you can be sure that you know what is good and what is evil. Like that for him is the moment of the fall, the desire for that kind of moral clarity, the desire for that knowledge of good and evil. Like that is the root of human sin for him. And so for Christians to then appeal to Bonhoeffer and say, oh, well, with him, we know what's right and what's wrong. It's like, no, he sees that fantasy of moral clarity as like the substance of sin. That is the definition of original sin.
Because it is like the self-righteousness. It's wanting to be my own
wanting to be the ground of good and evil oneself, rather than letting God be the ground of good and evil.
Interesting. That's a cool idea.
Yeah,
that makes sense to me. I just find it so it's too bad, because I find, I'm thinking back to the movie, I find like this moral quandary I think would make for a great movie.
Right.
Like it is the I guess you could say the drama built into being a human.
Right.
Like, is this not the experience of making an actual decision? And I think, you could have portrayed that in a movie in a pretty cool way of him really wrestling with this. So it'd
be like bad. Winter Light or First Reformed or something. Like there are movies about like moral, kind of riven moral conscience, like a real kind of moral agony,
right?
That are compelling dramas, but those are good movies, and this is a bad movie. And so this one wants to be a kind of popcorn munching, let's fight the bad guys kind of a thing. And in doing so, it just completely shreds Bonhoeffer's legacy.
Yeah. And that really that's the bummer. That it's it's wouldn't be right to say it's a stain on his legacy. It's just a misrepresentation.
It really is. Yeah. It really just completely gets him wrong in really fundamental ways, which, as someone who, I think I share with the creators of the movie and with fans of the movie a real feeling of indebtedness to Bonhoeffer, that like so much of my thinking has been shaped by his writings and his own way of thinking. But to see them come to this conclusion of what his legacy is, what the kind of lessons that he's teaching are, that are so diametrically opposed to the lessons that are on the pages that he wrote is pretty disheartening.
Yeah. Yeah, it's too bad.
Yeah.
It's missed
What are you gonna do?
opportunity for
Yeah.
a great movie.
Yeah, it could have been. Maybe someday someone will make the good Bonhoeffer movie, but
Yeah.
hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. I want to ask you then, like, more, I guess, practical, ethical questions because I'm picturing somebody listening and just thinking like, okay, I can follow along. There's no right thing to do. I'm kind of guilty no matter what. And you could even read that or hear that as like talking about original sin, or saying like, I'm stuck in a condition of sin.
Right.
I think like that's relatively easy to track with. The harder thing is like, okay, am I supposed to live an entire life with a guilty conscience?
Yeah.
Like I guess I would ask maybe you speaking for Bonhoeffer, or just you and you're thinking about it. Like, how do you then go about your life without feeling just perpetually guilty all the time?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the answer, maybe the unsatisfying part of the answer, is like you do that. That is what you're supposed to do. That like, there's this great philosopher, Theodor Adorno, who says you can't live wrong life rightly. That kind of, if you're in a situation in which every moral decision that you have is wrong, is just tainted with violence, if you're up to your neck in blood, then you can't live that life rightly. And so, you shouldn't try to find ways to soothe your conscience and convince yourself that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
If you're in a situation in which there is no right thing to do. So I think part of the answer is, maybe we should all just have guilty consciences, at least like those of us who live in the U.S. in the year 2025. Like maybe we could do with feeling a little bit more guilty more of the time. But I think also the flip side of that is Bonhoeffer's real abiding faith in God's forgiveness, which is that we are forgiven. We have already been forgiven. Everyone has already been forgiven. And so there's this, I think, the kind of moral drama of Bonhoeffer's thinking that I am really invested in carrying forward is this kind of holding together, on the one hand, a real awareness of moral failure and moral limitation, a real awareness of we are in a situation in which we cannot choose rightly. Every decision that we are faced with is a sifting between wrong choices, is a choice between different kinds of sinful activity. That just is what the condition of sin is moral limitation and inevitable moral failure. And that feels bad. Like that doesn't feel good to live wrong life wrongly, is to navigate these kind of impossible moral decisions. And at the same time, holding that together with faith and forgiveness, it's a difficult tightrope to walk, because trusting in God's forgiveness shouldn't then mean, okay, well, I shouldn't feel bad about anything I do because, hey, I'm forgiven. We are forgiven for the wrong things that we're doing. So there is a real awareness of wrong there. You can't have forgiveness without real consciousness of wrongdoing.
Right.
But at the same time, not letting that inevitability of moral failure lead us to a kind of apathy of like, well, it doesn't matter what I do. You hear this a lot on the left when people say like, oh, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, so I'm just going to buy, the Temu fast fashion, whatever, because like there's no right answer anyway, so I might as well just do the wrong thing. I think Bonhoeffer is he's wanting to navigate between those two poles of an apathy because, well, I can't do the right thing anyway, so there's no difference between the wrong options. And on the other hand, well, I'm forgiven, so it doesn't matter what I do because God's going to forgive me. Like he wants to walk this tightrope. And I think for him, and I agree with him, walking that tightrope means living with a certain degree of moral discomfort at the very least, if not moral agony. Like he was someone who did not have a lot of moral confidence, rightly so. Like that is the kind of the outcome of his thinking, is that we can't have that kind of confidence. And so I think, to answer your question, how do you go through life without feeling guilty all the time? I think the answer is you should go through life feeling guilty all the time, but that guilt shouldn't lead you to despair and apathy of like, well, I'm so guilty and everything's wrong, so who cares? Because we have this faith in God's forgiveness. But it is confidence that God will forgive us for the things that we are well and truly guilty of. And so we should feel that guilt. while also being confident in God's forgiveness.
Yeah, I hear Paul in the back of my head.
Yeah.
Shall we go on sinning? By no means.
Yeah, right.
Or Jesus with the Samaritan woman. Go on, sin no more. Or even when he heals the paralytic in John, and he says, go sin no more so that nothing bad happens to you again. And you're like, what are you talking about?
Right.
But there is this constant emphasis, like, oh no, like, try not to sin.
Right. And you're going to fail.
Yeah, right.
The quote, try, fail again, fail better. Yeah. It's a constant, like, yes, we have no choice but to sin, but we have to be discerning about which of these wrong options are we going to choose, and why are we going to choose those wrong options, without letting that kind of moral deliberation trick us into thinking that by choosing we have chosen rightly.
Yeah. It's like it's worth it to think very hard about these things.
Yeah.
And to do so avoiding the temptation of thinking, once I've done my deliberation, I will have found the right answer.
Right. Yeah. Like a lot of people, I think, kind of, people are familiar with and sometimes comfortable with a kind of lesser evil calculus. You hear this a lot whenever elections come up. Like, oh, well, these are both bad options, but I'm choosing the lesser evil. And I think it's a very quick leap from I have chosen the lesser evil to I have chosen correctly.
Yes.
When the point is that if you're choosing the lesser evil, you are choosing evil, and that's bad, and you should feel bad about that. So, like, there is really, I think, there's an importance in keeping that awareness of the ways in which we have chosen evil, even if we are constrained by necessity to choose evil, even if we feel like we have no other choice but to choose evil, it's still choosing evil. And so you still have to repent and ask for forgiveness and begin again, even though you're inevitably going to choose evil further down the line.
Yeah. And I mean, that is, like you said, humility earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, that really is it's a beautiful picture of humility. And I think like you've also used the language of like throwing yourself at the feet of Jesus, and to say, okay, I'm going to live with a guilty conscience, but is that not why we believe in a redeeming Savior? Is that not the presupposition of the faith? And to say, I'm going to try to move my confidence from myself onto God, right? To say, instead of being confident in my moral decision making, I'm going to be all the more confident on God's forgiveness and ultimate goodness.
Yeah. With the important awareness that being forgiven by God also doesn't mean made morally right. That also isn't a shortcut to a kind of moral confidence. That, like, to be forgiven by God for Bonhoeffer is to be loved as a sinful and sinning person, not kind of a ticket out of sin. That, like, that redemption for him, I think it was in his theology, I think it's better understood as like reconciliation, that like we are reconciled to God as sinful creatures, but that doesn't get us out of being sinful creatures. That doesn't kind of save us from being morally finite and bound to moral failure. That, like, we're always going to be moral failures. It's just that we are loved by God as the moral failures that we are.
Yeah, interesting. For that, we will wait for new creation, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's not. I think it maybe sounds like it's not a very comforting picture, but I find it very comforting. This idea that, like, we are always loved and always forgiven as the inevitably failing and erring and wrongdoing creatures that we are. And
you don't have to be something else for God to love you.
Yeah. And God loving you isn't going to magically make you something else, where now you can say, oh, well, I've been redeemed, I've been saved, so now I can be more confident of my moral judgments than I were before. Like, for Bonhoeffer, it's always moral failure. It's always moral limitation. And there's no way out of that. It's just, are you confident that despite your constant tripping up and constant doing the wrong thing, you will always be loved and forgiven?
Yeah. Sounds about right. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. This is now episode 26 of the show already. And this is exactly why I wanted to do the show and keep doing it. I feel like this is exactly the conversation I want to have. just for how thought-provoking it is, and to say like, oh, there's more going behind it. There's more going on here than just what the movie's telling me.
Yeah.
And it's actually done in good faith to think, what did Bonhoeffer actually think? Like, would he approve of this movie, or would he approve of this representation of him? And which is why I appreciate you doing the research on it. I think this is like a perfect example, like why higher ed is so important, why we need people in the academy studying religion.
Yes.
So yeah, that's my long-winded way of saying thanks.
Yeah, and I would say, if anyone watched the movie and enjoyed it, like pick up his ethics, pick up his letters and papers from prison. They're really engaging reading. He's a really good writer. The letters and papers have this real drama in them, and just see what he said for himself. Kind of take his own words, and if what you know of him mostly comes through the movie, you'll probably be surprised by what you find in there.
All right. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course.